Welcome to Oh God What Now? I'm Dorian Lynskey. On today's show, what do the local election results tell us about what's happening on Labour's left flank? And is success bringing problems for the Green Party? Plus, John Smith died 30 years ago this week. The day after his death, the Daily Mirror declared him the best Prime Minister Britain never had, and that's still a popular view. We discuss his reputation and what might have happened if he had lived with historian Anthony Broxton. And in the extra bit for supporters, we're talking about Baby Reindeer, the most talked about show of the year so far, and not always in a good way. Let's meet the panel. Ros Taylor is the host of Jam Tomorrow and author of The Future of Trust. Hi, Ros.
Hello, Dorian.
Exciting news, the very day we record, that Natalie Elphicke, MP for Dover and Deal, has defected from the Tories to Labour. But she's not really a kind of centrist character. She's been very hardline on immigration, very hardline on her husband's conviction for sexual offences, for which she was suspended for a day and had to apologise. It has not been greeted by the Labour family with open arms. So why are people very unhappy about Elphicke?
I don't really want to go into Natalie Elphicke's marriage to the sex offender and former MP Charlie Elphicke. I mean, that's over now. But she did make some very dubious judgment calls on whether and how to support him and got herself very briefly suspended from the Commons as a result. So a lot of it is about that. But it's also about, as you say, that she's got quite hardline views on immigration. But of course, that's exactly what makes her so valuable to Labour. It's implicitly saying people who have hardline views on immigration can rely on Labour to solve this problem for you. Now, we might have our doubts about that, but that's the implicit promise. And this feels like one of those kind of periodic occasions when Starmer dares his MPs to turn against him. He does something quite shameless, and then he kind of dares them. And if when they don't act, he emerges stronger. It's almost like he's toughening them up for the compromises of power.
We should say that Elphicke is also very interested in housing and renters' rights, and there is some point of overlap with Labour. Mm-hmm. What I wonder, though, is this happens. I mean, there's some people who are annoyed every time a Tory defects and they go, well, look at how they voted. And it's like, yes, they voted with the Tory party of which they were a member. Like, it's not as if they're going to have this sort of left-wing voting record. This case seems to have got a lot of people who wouldn't normally be annoyed, like, John Harris, for example, from The Guardian. Is there ever a case for just telling a defector to fuck off and go, no, we don't want you?
Yeah, there probably is. But at this point in the parliamentary term, when she's not going to be standing again, and certainly not for Labour, I think it was just too tempting. I think you've got to take the kind of biblical view. There's more joy in heaven over one sinner that repenteth. And, if heaven is the Labour Party.
Hugo Rifkind is a Times radio host and columnist for The Times. Hi, Hugo.
Hello.
The Ministry of Defence has been hacked, exposing the payroll records of 270,000 personnel, and fingers are pointing at China, but China's denied involvement, so they probably didn't do it. What's going on? Like, if China did do it, why would they do that?
China hacks all the time. China's always hacking. In my understanding of China's hacking, it is largely not sophisticated, but it is huge in scale, huge numbers of people doing it, always trying to hack everything all the time. This has obviously been a success. The most interesting thing about this is the way we've made it public that it happened. This is the new approach. We keep doing this. This is what they did with the Electoral Commission hack earlier in the year when MPs' emails were hacked as well. They made that public. This is what you do now. You call it out. It's very much not what we did in the Cold War. Never once in the Cold War did we say, oh, we've been successful infiltrated.
Oh, the Russians are at it again.
They're at it again. Look what they've gone and done. We'd make it public back then when things were counted or people were arrested. But we wouldn't say, hey, world, look what these guys are doing. And there's something really fascinating in geopolitics about that. It's a bit like what the West did as well before the Ukraine war started, where everyone was like, this is our intelligence, they're about to attack, we know this, cards on the table. And I wonder if it's sort of a response to the decades before that, the many leaks there were from intelligence services, Snowden, WikiLeaks, all that kind of stuff, where these days the approach is basically to sort of stay ahead, a step ahead of the information war, to say, this is what we know, this is what's happening. And it's the only weapon we've got.
Why is China doing that? It's a bit rude.
Well, I mean, I'm sure we are fairly consistently doing our utmost to hack China. Again, China hacks everything all the time. People have said, did they want financial details, salary details to open people up to blackmail? I'm sure that's a perk, but mainly They're just hacking all the time. If they can put it to use afterwards for their nefarious purposes, I'm sure they will.
They just love hacking.
They just love hacking.
Our guest today, I don't know if he loves hacking, is a political historian, editor of the Tides of History project, and author of Hope and Glory, Rugby League in Thatcher's Britain, Anthony Broxton. Welcome back, Anthony.
Pleasure.
Rishi Sunak is desperately trying to suggest, based on some weirdo Sky News projection, that there could be a hung parliament after the next election and a Labour-led coalition of chaos. Oh no, not chaos. Is this a wise strategy?
Well, it's one that's worked for the Tories in the past. We look historically, Thatcher in 79, to bring Thatcher into it straight away, talked about we don't want another minority government, another coalition, because that's what they'd been with Labour. 1992, when John Major and Neil Kinnock were neck and neck, John Major talked a lot about the dangers of hung parliament. And then again, obviously, with David Cameron and the SNP coalition of chaos, the most famous one of recent times, kind of worked. Doesn't feel like it's going to work this time because of how far they are behind in the polls and all the chaos that's happened. I suppose the interesting thing is whether Labour actually go on this argument, because they're the ones who probably have to drill home to people that a hung parliament could happen, and that they the election is not won yet, so get out and vote Labour and prevent us having to govern as a coalition or a minority.
I wonder, because the Tories really are sort of making the argument like, well, considering that they can't win, I mean, they're not deliberately making this argument, but effectively they're making the argument, you'd better make sure Labour has a majority if you don't want chaos.
Yes.
Whereas Cameron was going, well, you can vote Tory and we could get a majority, which in fact is what they did. Whereas presumably nobody believes that the Tories can get a majority.
Yeah, and I think, people like John Curtis, who've said, Labour have a 99% chance of forming the next government. He's done it projecting that there is no one for the Tories to work with. So it's going to be hard for Sunak to sustain that message and people to probably believe it. But it's a last throw of the dice, Hail Mary. I'm probably not the last throw of the dice. There'll probably be other ones, but this is just the latest one. I'm sure it won't last until the election. This won't be the line.
It's really in a what have we got to lose territory.
Yeah, and it's worked before, as I say, in those elections, that they're probably thinking, well, if we can cast enough doubt in enough minds. And during an election campaign, there is always a sort of wobbly moment where a poll comes out that it shows it's neck and neck. It happened in 97. It's happened in other elections, that they're hoping that there'll just be enough doubt in minds that we don't want a coalition of chaos. But showing people what that looks like is going to be the hard bit for him.
Are we sure voters don't like coalitions? I know politicians don't like coalitions. Politicians are like, well, because we won't get to do what we want, and nor will anyone else. There'll have to be some kind of compromise with consensus and stuff. But I'm sure there are voters who look at the Conservatives and go, well, I don't want totally that. And even people who look at Labour and go, well, I don't want totally that. And so the idea of a bit that, I'm not sure it's quite as frightening as people think it is.
Well, we had a coalition.
Yeah.
We didn't seem to like it much.
We didn't love him, but it wasn't chaos. So that's the idea, the suggestion that the coalition is chaos. And maybe with the SNP, there was that suggestion. It's like, oh no, this tears apart the union. But the idea that if there would be just a coalition with like the Lib Dems.
Yeah, the nightmare scenario of a Labour-Lib Dem coalition. Doesn't work for me. I'm sorry.
Cameron and Clegg seemed to quite enjoy it, didn't they, at the time, before the election came. And people thought that was going to happen again. And people have kind of got used to it. It is something that is always thrown at Labour during election time, that they're going to have to go and work with these fringe parties. It may be the Greens this time, it may be the SNP. So you hype up the fringes and say that Starmer's going to be beholden to them. So that's the strategy I'm assuming that Sunak's gone for.
Maybe it's because Labour themselves would hate to be in a coalition. I mean, Gordon Brown had a bit of opportunity in 2010 and he didn't take it.
Starmer has been a bit more reflective than Sunak after the local elections, despite doing much better than the Prime Minister, all things considered. Record support for the Greens and Independents, including 2 council seats for George Galloway's Workers' Party of Britain in Rochdale, suggests Labour are losing some left-wing and Muslim voters to other parties. The West Midlands race between Labour's Richard Parker and Tory Andy Street would not have been a nail-biter if not for pro-Gaza independent Ahmed Yaqub. Labour also lost control of Oldham Council, fell short in Oxford due to the Gaza factor, underperformed, according to some estimates, by almost 100 seats. And the co-chair of Momentum, remember them, has quit Labour over the war in Gaza. Speaking in Birmingham, Starmer said, "I say directly to those who may have voted Labour in the past but felt on this occasion they couldn't, that across the West Midlands we are a proud and diverse community." He hasn't really promised much there, but he's sort of going, come back, please. Ros, is there a clear pattern to Labour's loss of support? What was overall a very good night? Can you put it down to specific causes in specific areas?
Yeah, you can. I mean, to return to John Curtis. Sorry, this is the second time we've mentioned John Curtis in this podcast.
He's actually sponsoring the podcast.
Yeah,
He's paying for the mics.
But he said that the party support is down by 8 points since last year in wards where more than 10% of people say they're Muslim. So that seems pretty clear. And the other point worth making is that where is this support going? Well, it seems to be going to Greens and Independents. And to a certain extent, in some places, to George Galloway's Workers' Party. So what that suggests is a desire for more radical policies, as well as anger over Gaza, disappointment maybe over the watering down of the Green Prosperity Plan. As far as we can tell, that's what it seems to suggest. Yeah.
And local election behaviour, we know, is very different from general election voting, which is why you cannot, in fact, do a projection based on local elections. But do you think some of these people are going to stay away from Labour, whether that be some Muslim voters or whether that be the ex-Corbynite voters?
I actually think they probably will. I'm not convinced that the local election behaviour of these people will be that different from the general election behaviour. These are angry people who are probably not interested in casting a tactical vote in order to remove the Tories. They are interested in making their voice heard. If you're going to elect a local councillor, based on your views on Gaza, as many supporters of Galloway's party did, is someone who has no power to change anything of what's going on in Gaza, then quite frankly, you're not likely to change your mind at the general election based on worries that Labour may not win it, particularly when they have such a big lead. So I think these voters a lot of them may well be lost. But there are different kinds of people here. I mean, it's as we said, it's not just people who are angry about Gaza. It's also people who think the Labour has moved too far to the right.
Hugo, do you think Labour miscalculated the intensity of feeling over Gaza, or they decided that, some loss of support was a price worth paying? It seems like the loss of support might be a bit larger than they imagined.
I think it's a bit of that. I think at the start they messed up. Weirdly enough, Keir Starmer didn't really mess up that much. They did that interview with Nick Ferrari on LBC where, it seems to me, I think he very obviously didn't mean to suggest that he was okay with Israel cutting off, food and water, power and water. It was one of those things where a question's asked and then another question's asked and you answer the one before and you end up in this sort of Wittgensteinian duck-rabbit situation where everyone can take the worst possible interpretation of what they wanted. Emily Thornberry afterwards is another matter because she sort of doubled down very much and she very much was asked, is it okay for Israel to cut off power and water? And she refused to say it wasn't. And that seemed to me to be sort of hapless Emily Thornberry in that way that she is sometimes. She just seemed to be in sort of defensive mode, defending what she thought was the position. But I'd be very surprised if Labour had sat down, if the shadow cabinet had sat down and had a meeting and gone, you know what, we're cool with them cutting off water and power. So I think they handled their position there really, really, really badly. Whether in the round they could have struck a dramatically different position on Gaza, I think it's sort of another matter. I mean, I think for one thing, at the start, they probably did believe that Israel was justified in a response. Because
this was in the week after October 7th.
This was in the week after October the 7th. And they probably did have a plan to stick relatively closely to what, for example, Joe Biden was saying. But the political calculation is they'll have been keen to show that the Corbyn era of Israel bad whatever was over. And whatever political fallout has followed, and there has, of course, been some. I think if they hadn't done that, the political fallout for them would be worse. That's not a moral argument, that's a political argument. But I think had they tread closer to the Corbyn line, had they been a party that people on protests were supporting rather than condemning, I don't think that would have worked very well for them in the polls. I'm not saying that's necessarily the reason why they made the decision. I'm sure there are moral considerations as well, but I think the counterfactual doesn't work well for them. And, sorry to drone on, but their position on a ceasefire has actually sort of been relatively strong for quite a long time. It wasn't as strong as the SNP's. The only reason they didn't support that ceasefire was because the SNP also wanted to condemn Israel for war crimes, which is something you can do when you're an activist party that I'm not sure you can do if you want to be a party of government, because there are repercussions.
Well, Labour's still suffering for those bungled remarks in week one. Like you said, they do support a ceasefire. They oppose the invasion of Rafa, but there's this new group, the Muslim Vote, which issued 18 demands. So there's a lot of demands. And it starts with apologize for greenlighting a genocide and not supporting the SNP motion. It goes on to like arms boycott, recognize Palestinian state, accept a definition of Islamophobia, Sharia pensions, boycott, divestment and sanctions, school prayer for Muslims. It's a lot. And that made me think, well, what could he do that would win back those people? I'm not saying that everybody has 18 demands, but I'm just wondering at this point, has the damage been done so that even going, do not go ahead with that invasion, there should be a ceasefire, is really not going to make any difference? I'm wondering what he can do when he's saying, oh, we're very sorry, we've lost you, but how do you get him back?
I mean, yeah, I think the idea of Starmer standing up and saying, we apologise for greenlighting genocide doesn't feel like a vote winner. But I mean, I think there's another way of talking about it. You can say the damage has been done. Has the damage been done, or has a coalition of political interests that had sort of coalesced over a period of years now diverged again, right? This is not new historical territory. I mean, I don't know where we have a historian here, but something that's frustrated me from the start of the Gaza debate is the historical illiteracy of it. And I hadn't even realised that the Iraq War was considered history these days, but it turns out it is. This is precisely what happened then. Labour lost a lot of support over their stance on Iraq. They were a government then. They went to war then. It was a bit more extreme. And yet they were still elected afterwards. And the sort of support they lost then is a lot like the sort of support they're losing now, combining a Muslim vote and people on the left. And they sort of drew a lot of them back through the Miliband and, of course, extremely the Corbyn years. They are not really Labour's core in the recent time. Labour's core is the soft left rather than the hard left. And so there was sort of an inevitability about this, whether it happened now over this issue or further down the line, I think.
So Anthony, obviously with the war going on and, images on the news every day and emotions are so high. So some of this is temporary, but if there were to be, if the ceasefire, that arrangement that's kind of been discussed doesn't look particularly hopeful, but, for example, if that carried out, if basically the war ended, how long would you think that it would take for some of these people to come back? Like, how permanent is this shift?
Yeah, it's back to the point Hugo was making about how much is it about this issue or is it about wider issues and that coalition that Starmer's trying to build?
Yeah.
He's obviously, had a huge task after the last election to try and win back those red wall voters and all the arguments about patriotism. And they went down that path, and some would say very successfully. I mean, it has been successful. If you look at the local election,
look at Hartlepool
was the
Blackpool
symbol,
South,
and they won, Blackpool, classic. And there's obviously been a calculation that they can't probably appeal to everyone. Probably, like you say, they didn't expect it to be as controversial as this, because foreign policy doesn't usually dominate the agenda as much, as this obviously has done. Obviously, Iraq was a huge issue that we'll talk about what might have happened had another leader been in charge. But I think this shows how difficult it is for Labour to keep that coalition together of the sort of working class red wall voters, these new left wing green voters who, came into the party in the Corbyn years. There was probably an expectation that they weren't going to keep them.
Yeah.
And we're sort of seeing that now. They're probably unlikely to come back, whatever happens, because there's other issues that Starmer's doing on policies and the U-turns over the commit pledges that he made at the beginning of his leadership that mean a lot of people don't trust him because of that. And that probably is irreparable with that group. And, in a way, they're right to think that, because he said he would do a lot of these things and he's reneged on them. So
I remember Jeremy Hardy once saying that he'd been a member of the Labour Party all his life with a brief hiatus between 1987 and 2016. And that's basically the constituency we're talking about here.
Yeah. And lots of people who say, I've been in the party all my life and they're like 60 on, they're leaving now. It's like, well, you went through the Iraq and I stayed through the Blair years, but I'm leaving now. It's quite interesting.
I'm not quite convinced when people go, I've been all my life. And it's like, have you? Or did you drop in and out?
This is the thing, because it's,
Well, I want to talk about Palestine as the issue. Like, George Galloway is a social conservative with a long track record of supporting various dictators, denying various war crimes. And I've just noticed on Twitter that some supporters, they say that doesn't matter. None of that matters because he is a strong pro-Palestine voice. Like, it doesn't matter what he says about like Syria or Ukraine or gay people. as long as it's in Palestine. Why is that issue, even before this war, why is that so totemic for part of the left? It almost seems as if you were pro-Palestine, like anything goes, like that's the one.
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure, really. I think there's obviously the George Galloway as a character comes back occasionally into British politics, and a new generation come along. And I think the way that he communicates politics is so different than a lot of people, and they're happy to sort of overlook a lot of things. But there has been a backlash to his Navarra interview, I think, on certain parts of the left, which is interesting. Is it that they didn't know about his social conservatism before, or that they feel like they have to disown him now because of that? I don't know. You'd have to ask them.
Certainly, there's a lot of different views out there.
Yeah.
Some people are just like, well, no way. But
If
I have
the
seen
herd
some
goes
people
against
going, I
him-
don't care
Yes.
because of Palestine, as if he's the only pro-Palestine MP. Anyway, Ros, the Green Party seems to be the most obvious natural home for the ex-Labour left, with some of the problems that brings. They're already investigating one new councillor over alleged anti-Semitism, including a tweet which appears to celebrate October the 7th. Are they prepared for this, basically seeing the disciplinary problems that Labour had under Corbyn? Do they realise that this is going to be something they're going to have to make a lot of calls? Because when this guy he hasn't been suspended, the guy got investigated, there were some Green candidates furious about this and just going, well, you shouldn't have backed down. He's got nothing to apologise for. You're just letting the MSM pull your strings. And I was like, I've seen this movie before.
No, they're not prepared. I mean, they should have been, because they've been moving in a much more left-wing direction for quite a while now, since they made a conscious decision, I think, to try and hoover up disillusioned left-wing voters from Labour rather than trying to go after people who were a bit bored by Ed Davey, for example.
There's
such people I know.
No. I'm sorry, Ed. But
Dynamic Davey.
And of course, the fact that they've been in coalition with the SNP until effectively in coalition recently in Scotland has influenced the whole direction of the party as well, because there's been a sort of scent of power and that set of direction. They've been very clear on Gaza, and they've deliberately gone, said, right, Labour is not going far enough. We're going to call for a ceasefire right from the beginning. We're going to condemn Israel as much as we can all the time. But the trouble is the party is now a very broad church. And yet it's a very small church still. It's like a very big church squeezing into a tiny chapel. And that creates even more problems than if you're a big party, because, when you're a small party, you've really got to focus on one thing in order to get people's attention. And to what extent are the people who are moving over to the Greens really, really committed to net zero? And on the other wing of Green support tends to be people who love nature passionately and want to preserve it at all costs. And of course, that creates its own potential conflicts, which the Greens were trying to grapple with a bit already. But now that you've got people whose number one issue is not necessarily green things, it is going to be very difficult for them.
The most prominent Green at the moment isn't one of the joint leaders. It's Deputy Leader Zach Polansky, who's sort of very active on social media. Tell us about him.
Yeah, very active. Polansky is interesting. He's on the London Assembly. He used to be a Lib Dem, so he
didn't everyone.
Well, this is why he gets accused sometimes of opportunism, because he didn't get selected for a seat he wanted in, I think, Southwest London. He's a former hypnotherapist. And
Are you ever really a former hypnotist, surely?
Well, this
You're
is
always a hypnotist.
Once you've got it, you can't lose it.
He's made you think he's a former hypnotist. But is he?
This is the point, really, because I did. I talked to quite a lot of activists last autumn after the Green Party conference and got a sense of what was going on there, because I couldn't go myself. I had COVID. So I said, what was it like? Who were the best speakers? And everyone said, Zach Polansky. His speech was so amazing. I felt so great after hearing him. It was like, he was literally the first person they mentioned. He's a very social justice Green. He's passionate about housing in particular. He's quite good at trying to explain why you can keep the green belt and still build more houses. And he's pushed back hard in the last few days against accusations of anti-Semitism against the Green Party as a Jewish person himself. And of course, that lends it all the more credibility, frankly, among his supporters. He was very, very nasty to Peter Mandelson, who had a go at Greens on Times Radio, I think. And he has been retweeting ex-Corbynites frantically. So it's clear what his strategy is.
Hugo, are disgruntled Corbynites a significant enough voting bloc that they could lose Labour seats? I mean, I suppose I'm thinking that like Bristol seems like somewhere that could go. I can't remember which seat, but parts of Bristol seats could go Green. Around the edges, are there kind of marginals that could be lost in the way that the West Midlands was almost lost?
I don't know. I would have thought not many. I mean,
we need John Curtis here.
Well, quite. But I mean, look, you've got to think back. Again, we were talking about when this happened before with Iraq, right? I mean, Iraq, Labour won the next election, the 2005 election. The Lib Dems did, who were the anti-Iraq party, the main one, I suppose. They got the most seats that they've ever had. The election after that, I think they were up by, maybe 11 seats. I would have thought the Greens are not the electoral force that the Lib Dems were back then, which is that's a damning thing to say about anybody. But I don't think. I mean, I don't think they can have such a broad coalition of support. So I can see them sort of chivying around the edges. But I think the number of people who will be prepared to, I'm sure there'll be a decent number of people who would like to vote for a more left-wing Labour, particularly with green overtones or undertones. I'm sure the number of people who'd be prepared to do that at the expense of voting for a Labour government right now is probably relatively small. How that looks in an electoral cycle's time could be dramatically different. But right now, I'd have thought that's small.
Because if you just think of that, there is a group of, I suppose, let's just say the sort of Corbynite left. And obviously when Corbyn was in charge, they were in Labour. And now they seem to be looking at the Greens. And there's always talk of a new Socialist Party. You might remember the Northern Independence Party being one. It seems to me, I could be wrong, but like it seems to me the reason why there isn't one and the reason why people like Owen Jones are doing a more kind of informal let's support groovy independence rather than trying to set up a party. Because it seems to me that half the members would be idealistic Corbynites and the other half will be Gallowayites, anti-Semites, assorted cranks. And so immediately they're going to have, in the most extreme, even more so than Labour and the Green, it's either look like the extreme crank party or start getting rid of people, and then you get into a whole thing about, oh, you've sold out and that's purges, and then there's going to be another split. And so I'm just wondering, the reason there is not been that left party that people have been talking about since Corbyn stopped being Labour leader is because they sort of know that.
I forget who it was who first said this, but this is the schism of the hard left. It's the Lennonites and the John Lennonites, right? And it's and they're sort of, and that is exactly what's going on now with Navarra having a pop at Galloway. You know, it is kind of unreconcilable, although they agree on various fundamental things. And I mean, then there's no shame in that. Why should it be reconcilable? I personally have a good deal more fondness for the John Lennonites, and the extent to which they're not prepared to put up with the Lennonites. Good on them.
Why is it so much easier to have a pressure party on the right? You know, like Reform or the Brexit Party before, because they've got some pretty fruity people in the Reform Party.
You've got to remember there was that whole kind of UKIP blowing apart Veritas, Kilroy Silk period. You know, I mean, admittedly, their schisms tended to be...
It's my favourite period, the Kilroy period.
Yeah. Their schisms tended to be personality-based rather than politics-based, but that's because their politics were generally quite unsophisticated. I mean, there's not massive success for a fringe party on the right. You know, the Brexit Party... I mean, UKIP did all right in the European parliaments, and the Brexit Party, you know, was a bit of a force. But Reform is a bit of a mess with sort of no MPs and isn't legally a political party anyway. So I wouldn't oversell that on the right either.
They do put a lot of pressure on the Tory party, though, don't they? These like the UKIP and the Brexit Party, and that's the thing that people are talking about now. And the question probably is how much does that then change the way that Labour approach things? There are always going to be people in Labour Party, Labour history who quite welcome these people leaving. You know, in '94, for example, when Arthur Scargill set up his own party, you read the Campbell Diaries, they're absolutely delighted that he's doing this. Does Starmer want that? Does he want more and more people to sort of leave the party and join? It's not that clear whether this is a strategy. or whether he actually wants to keep some of them in, or is he going to have to offer something to these disgruntled people, on the left at some point in the next year or so to get them back to vote for him?
Well, what helps the left, though, do you think? Because obviously they would like to have some influence. The Socialist Campaign Group seems very weak. Nobody seems to be pushing Starmer to the left. Might they have more success if basically Momentum just sort of detached itself from Labour, joined up with sort of Greens, Independent, whatever form that might take? Do you think they would have any more success as a pressure group outside Labour, a la Reform, than trying to fight for the left inside?
I mean, that's a classic conundrum that's faced many left-wing people in the Labour Party, through its history. People like Corbyn, for example, always stayed in the Labour Party, pushed from within. Some people left the party. I think, it's if it's Momentum, they're probably their influence on Labour is probably done now. But there are still going to be left-wing MPs that will have quite a bit of influence in the Labour Party, as people like Corbyn, Diane Abbott, John McDonnell did throughout that new Labour administration. They stayed and fought, and there will be a sort of push for those people. They will talk a lot more if Labour get into power and start doing things. They keep the powder dry now. People like Richard Bergen and people who were Rebecca Long Bailey, others. They will, all the people we've probably forgotten about now that are still there, and keeping the powder dry, because they probably recognise, well, if Labour are going to get in, we're going to have a lot more influence if we're MPs in that party than if we're on the outside in the Greens.
Also, I think mentioning Richard Bergen perhaps is a little bit unfair, because they've also some quite talented MPs on the left.
That was the first person from those years that came to mind, because he was quite prominent. He did a leaders debate for Corbyn, so he was, But yeah, I take your point. There are a lot better examples, probably.
But thanks for reminding me about Veritas, because I just remembered I went to the launch of Veritas.
Well done.
19 years ago. I just looked up the piece I wrote about it because of the wonders of the internet, and Robert Kilroy Silk, and it was just extraordinary. He actually said, "I can't help my tan or my looks, and I don't intend to, and I'm not ashamed."
Wow. Honest politics.
Now let's have a question from one of our Patreon backers in But Your Emails. If you support us, you too can submit a question for the panel. You can get in touch through Patreon or by emailing info@romaniacs.com, our old school email address. This is from Benedict Cohen. What external pressures could force Sunak to call an election? It appears that the noises within the Tory party for a leadership challenge have quietened, thus removing the internal threat. But could public disquiet become significant enough to force his hand? Anthony, are there cases where public disquiet forced somebody to call an election when they don't have to? I'm trying to think of
put me on the spot there. Public disquiet.
I can't think of one where
the classic Sunak case seems to me is just going to go right to the end in a way that James Callaghan, went on and on. The same way that John Major went on, and the same way that Gordon Brown went on and on. There is never seems to be a time when you're that far behind that it seems right to go to the polls, because you always think something could come up. Economy, war, anything. Who knows? We can't imagine what it would be for Sunak to turn this around. But they must be thinking, keep going, keep going, keep going. Could be wrong on that. But I can't think of historical
there was
example.
Who governs, but that's different really, because that's about, who's in charge? Is it the Labour Party or is it the unions? That was a different kind of...
And no one really wanted...
Sorry, Tory Party or the unions,
And no one wanted that election, really. He sought an opportunity to go for that and went for that because he thought he would win.
Well, you do it because you think you could win. I think maybe where I don't buy Benedict's premise is the fact that if people are really, really unhappy with you, you feel sort of like obliged to call an election. But I think the opposite is the case, because you think, well, if we hang on, maybe they're less unhappy. You're not going to call it because people hate you so much that they want you to go. That's the last time you're going to want to do it. I can't think of when that's ever happened.
I don't think there are any external factors that could cause that, and the internal factors will be odd and erratic. You can see some sort of spiraling momentum thing happening where suddenly there are cabinet ministers going, and he's like, right, election. I think the thing that would force an election is we would be more likely to have an election than a leadership battle. And if there was a prospect for a leadership battle, then we get an election instead.
I've definitely come around to the idea of like a December-January situation.
I can't remember who said that he'll go to January so that his Wikipedia page shows that he was Prime Minister till 2025.
It's
So
got
it
to be
always looks
November.
better. It's 3 years rather than 2.
I think they're waiting until the last possible minute now.
But old people don't come out to vote when it's nasty and icy and stuff. It's so risky. I mean, he does still want a decent number of Tory MPs. That's what he's hanging on for. He's hanging on for the hope that the Tory party can in some way still maintain a decent presence in the Commons. And he has turned it around a bit. And if you put yourself in a situation in December, January, where quite possibly elderly people won't come out to vote, who are still who are the only Tory Labour supporters, it is suicide. It really is. No, it can't happen.
I just can't get away from the idea that he's going to fuck Glastonbury for me. That's what I think.
I'm not going this year, so I don't mind that one.
30 years ago, on May 12, 1994, Labour leader John Smith suffered a fatal heart attack. The next day, the Daily Mirror's front page called him the best Prime Minister we never had. A few weeks ago, a viral tweet made the same claim of Jeremy Corbyn, and about 90% of the replies, I've scrolled through them all, said, no, actually, it's John Smith. Why is Smith still lionised across the breadth of the Labour Party and beyond? What kind of Prime Minister would he have been? And would he, as some people clearly believe, have rendered New Labour unnecessary? So I'm going to ask, who remembers hearing the news?
Yeah, I remember hearing the news very well. He was an Edinburgh guy. He lived next door to my aunt and uncle, in fact.
Oh,
in Morningside. So I remember it very well. He was friends with my dad as well, because they were all Scottish politicians were friends in the 80s and 90s, because they all got the same flight home on a Thursday night.
right.
So there was a bit of a club of them. So yeah, I remember it very well.
Because it was shortly after, for me, it was like Bill Hicks, Kurt Cobain, John Smith.
What a band.
All jamming in heaven. But no, I just generally thought, what the fuck? Like my favourite comedian, like the biggest rock star, and now the next Prime Minister. I was like spring 94 was just a fucking kill zone. But I don't really think I understood really that much about him beyond the fact that he seemed quite nice and sensible and I liked Labour. Anthony Smith does not get a chapter in Steve Richards' book, The Prime Ministers We Never Had, because he died rather than failed. So the story is sort of not as interesting. But is that the main reason his reputation is so high? That he didn't get to fail. He didn't get to disappoint anybody. You can project whatever you want onto him.
I think that's very much the case. And over the years, the mythology around John Smith has changed. So people have tried to claim it as their own. You know, you saw this massively on the 10-year anniversary of his death. People were talking about, well, if John Smith had lived instead of Tony Blair, we wouldn't have gone to Iraq. We would have joined the Euro. We would have had a strong relationship with Europe. You know, Robin Cook, after he resigned over Iraq, wrote a really long piece which I read recently about what the world would have looked like had John Smith survived. Wouldn't have been as close to America at a time when people didn't like George Bush. And this has gone on, you know, through the years. It came back again during the Brexit years when people started to say, well, John Smith would have wanted a second referendum. Tom Watson made a speech on the anniversary of John Smith's death, which that would have been the 25th year, essentially, 5 years ago. And he said, look, John Smith would want a second referendum. We should have a second referendum. And in Labour mythology, it is, you know, this happened in the sort of 70s and 80s. Hugh Gateskill, who was another Labour leader who died just before he was going to come to office, was mythologised by different people in the party, actually mythologised by Margaret Thatcher, who used to say, wow, Labour used to have these great leaders like Hugh Gateskill. Look at the state of them now. But of course, he never got to power, so he never got to do the things that Margaret Thatcher wouldn't have liked.
He died suddenly as well.
He died suddenly as well. And Labour seemingly, the two big Labour, you know, prime ministers, Harold Wilson, Tony Blair, came into office on the back of these deaths when really they shouldn't have been the prime ministers, which is sort of quirk of history. I don't know how much is in that they die and then they inherit a strong position because both of them inherited strong poll leads.
Well, tell us where he came from and where he fitted into the Labour Party. Would you say that he was, like, in terms of, like, you know, Labour right, soft left, Gateskill-ite, like where did he sort of sit?
Yeah, this was the thing. He was really hard to pin down in a way. He was a Gateskill-ite. You know, he rose through the party in the 50s, 60s, was spotted by Gateskill as someone who could do, you know, good things for the party. But in the 1980s, when Labour was sort of engaged in civil war, he didn't leave to join the SDP when many people thought he might have done, but he also didn't engage massively in the battles that Neil Kinnock did with militant and left. Some people criticised him for that, that he didn't get his hands dirty in a public-facing way. But that meant by the time that he became leader, lots of people for a long time in the 1980s, if you go back and read comment pieces and all those things, they say Labour will be better led by John Smith than Neil Kinnock. He's smarter, he's more presentable, he's better, which is kind of always the case when you've got a leader. People always look to who could be in charge instead. And obviously when Neil Kinnock lost in 1992, John Smith was in the box seat to take the leadership, and he did. But what people say at the time was that he was really hard to pin down in terms of factions in the Labour Party. He would speak to people on the left like Tony Benn, who quite liked him. He was close to people like Ken Livingstone, not close in the sense of had him working alongside him, but would go and speak to him and tell him what he was doing. And Ken Livingstone would say, well, even though we disagree, he will always be honest about what he's going to do. So that made him a sort of very popular figure with a lot of people in the party. But for the modernisers, the Gordon Brown and Tony Blair and Alex Campbell's and Peter Mandelson's, who were not really... I mean, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair were making their way, but Philip Gould, Peter Mandelson, Alex Campbell were not involved in the John Smith leadership, so they were agitating for faster,
Well, Campbell
bigger
talks
change.
about the frantics versus the long gamers, and that Smith is obviously like, Kinnock's taken us a certain way, and we've just modernised enough, but he was still quite close to the Union, so he didn't want to kind of, he wouldn't want to sort of weaken those ties as much as Brown and Blair. But when he died, I believe he was like 20 points, Labour was 20 points ahead. Did Brown and Blair and Campbell have a point that more needed to be done? Is there any doubt, you think, that Labour would have won?
That's the classic what if, isn't it? And we just will never know what would have happened had John Smith gone into election. The thing that John Smith was sort of represented and why there was such an outpouring of grief when he died is that, I mean, shock horror, this was the early 90s. Tories are engulfed in various aspects of sleaze, corruption, lots of other things that are happening. They're just being attacked. There's low expectations on politicians. You have things like House of Cards, The Politician's Wife, all these sort of dramas that are showing a really sort of dirty Westminster scene that had emerged in the 1980s. And that John Smith was trying to set himself above that. And the way that he wanted to do that from doing the research was that he was going to hand power to the regions, things like devolution, empower local councils. But the modernisers, the Blair, didn't think that was enough to win an election, and that you needed to show firmly that this was not the same party as it was in the 1980s. John Smith famously didn't like focus groups. There's a story in Deborah Mattison's book where he famously walks out of the focus group and accuses all the people in there of being Tories, and he doesn't want anything to do with it. Now, when Blair becomes leader in 94, there's a complete shift back to what it had been before, where they're heavily sort of focus group. So, I mean, there was I saw a poll that 75% of people thought that John Smith was like a nice guy, and Anthony King, who was the big pollster at the time, said these are the best opinion polls that Labour have had for a generation, going back to the 1960s, and that was a month before he died. So who knows what would have happened in the election? Press might have come for him. He probably wouldn't have won the support of the Sun. Can't imagine he would be, a godfather to Rupert Murdoch's children or anything like that. But he probably would have won because of the ERM, similar to the mini budget. Once that happens, it's so hard to sort of come back.
Ros, Anthony quotes a 99 documentary in which Labour MPs tell Anne McElvoy, new Labour was never really necessary and the party has sold its soul for nothing. That was basically the story of John Smith. So is that what he represents? That even though at the time, like Corbyn was unhappy with John Smith, as he was unhappy with every Labour leader except Jeremy Corbyn, there was unrest on the left. But now do you think that people that might even have sort of, criticised him then love him because he is the symbol of a world in which New Labour never happened?
Yeah, I mean, there's that gulf in Labour between those who really believed in New Labour and the Third Way and all that sort of thing, and those who didn't and slightly despise themselves for going along with it, and have very, very mixed feelings about their decision to do so. And they tell themselves it was to win power, but what if they could have won power anyway.
Yeah.
And as you say, they were 23 points ahead in 1994. They just had it's almost like today. They had really bad council elections for the Tories. It was scarily similar 30 years ago to now in that way. Yeah.
But do you think that some people on the left, who just go, if only John Smith would have just found reasons to dislike him once it got to the campaign, once he got into government, that he sort of made out to be more of this sort of unifying force than he would have been?
Yeah, I mean, I think he'd always have compromised too much for them, because being in power leads to compromise. It's interesting, the trade union things. He abolished the trade union voting bloc at a conference, didn't he? He brought in one member, one vote, which was at the time quite controversial.
Yeah.
And he was very one more heave. That was his thing. One more heave, and we will get power. Whereas the New Labour modernisers were very much, no, not one more heave, one more complete change of direction, or one complete change of direction, and that is what will do it. But it is really interesting to think how he would have handled 9/11, to think how he would have handled Europe, whether he would have, as you say, joined the euro, because he did vote to join the European community, unlike some people in Labour. So he was quite pro-Europe.
Which was quite big for him at a time when the party wasn't, totally for it, and he was a young MP and he sided with...
Well, a lot of the
Rod
people who
Jenkins.
sided, and then a lot of those people, obviously the pro-Europeans, then went off to form the SDP, which...
Yeah, and he never wavered from his pro-European stance, really. He wanted Britain to be at the forefront of Europe, in the 90s. That probably would have been quite difficult to do as Prime Minister, though, with the press as we know it.
Hugo, Sky Adam Bolton wrote quite an interesting little sort of reflection on John Smith, and he thought that he would have been unlikely to win a third term because he wouldn't have got the centre ground. So there was no doubt that he would have won in 97, or indeed the next time, but maybe would not have had as long a run as Blair did. On the other hand, there's something, what people seem to like about him was he didn't like focus groups, and he didn't like, Mandelson and Gould and all that lot. And he just seemed like a sensible, decent, family bank manager. So what do you think? Do you think that would have been a weakness, almost his lack of kind of glamour and the limits to his modernisation?
Well, there's an extent to which, even as a figure, he was sort of pre-90s. It's quite hard to see, because you look at Blair, you look at Brown, you look at Cameron. To a lesser extent, sort of Johnson and May and so on. But still, there's a generational shift there. And John Smith, I know he wasn't a lot older than Blair, but he was
55, I think, when he died.
There you go. Which is 10 years probably older than Blair was at the time, thereabouts. He felt like a different generation. He felt like more of the John Majory generation, which indeed he was.
Well, like when I read that he'd sort of been identified as a possible future Prime Minister by Callaghan.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, Callaghan, we didn't know who Blair was, because he wasn't even an MP yet. Yeah.
But what I mean is, when you think of somebody like what would John Smith have looked like on the far side of Cool Britannia and Britpop? Would that quite have made sense? Would it have been a sense of a more old-fashioned sense of youth versus the establishment, with him being the establishment? I'm not quite sure how that kind of plays. But it's very hard. It's a real.
It's hard to imagine him. It's hard to imagine
series,
with the shaking hands with Noel Gallagher.
Well, sure,
which was not the most important thing that happened.
That being said, I had one time when I interviewed Billy Bragg, I had a very similar conversation to this with him, and he saw that generational shift as having happened with Neil Kinnock. He said the most important fact about Neil Kinnock was that Neil Kinnock was a member of the Gene Vincent fan club. And he said that, and I laughed, and he was cross with me.
Oh no, I've heard that,
because he really meant
it.
Really meant it. Yeah.
Well, Billy Bragg really didn't like John Smith. I found an
Really?
old Newsnight interview where Billy Bragg was making the argument that he kind of makes all the time, that Labour aren't doing enough, they're not radical enough. And there was a Newsnight interview, which I'll put out on Tides in the next few days, where they go to a Blackpool and they speak to Labour activists in this focus group, and they're all actually really depressed about John Smith's leadership. They're saying there's nothing, we're not doing anything, we're not setting the agenda. All the interesting things are happening on the fringes of politics, in the 90s. But, you could always probably find that in the Labour activist space. We're not doing enough. We're not being radical enough. We're letting the Tories get away with it, because there's an institutional fear, as there is still with Starmer, that maybe it's not going to happen, and that one more heave, as you say, is not enough, and you need to really go for it.
What sort of government then do you imagine that he would have led? Obviously, the assumption is, okay, no Iraq war, that's crucial. But obviously, New Labour did a lot more than that. Is it possible to extrapolate from his sort of values and his rhetoric, and indeed his sort of policies by 94, and sort of go, oh, this is how this government would have differed?
On the policy, the point is always made that the manifesto in 97 was essentially John Smith's platform. He'd outsourced a lot of the policy making to like the IPPR, so things like freedom of information and minimum wage, they were all John Smith's policies. What would have been totally different in that early period is, like you say, the presentation that Tony Blair obviously had. And you've got to remember, Bill Clinton in America had done his thing as a young candidate and was doing politics in a different way that John Smith just would not have been able to do. John Smith was actually older than John Major, I think. Yeah, no, that's true. And he would not have been able to do the youth thing in 97. Yeah. In government, what impact that would have had, on a counterfactual documentary that Andrew Marr made in 1999, he says things like John Smith wouldn't have built the Millennium Dome and he wouldn't have been interested in fads like that. But the most important thing, I suppose, and the thing that will always be reflected on is the relationship with Europe. People believe that John Smith was a passionate supporter of the EU and believed that the thing that was holding Britain back in the 90s wasn't the EU, it was the Euroscepticism, and that if he could become Prime Minister, Britain could really lead in the EU. And that is just something that will always appeal to Labour people. So until Labour reconciles, with the EU, for example, they're probably always going to look to John Smith and say, well, it would have been very, very different with him. And it's counterfactual and it's kind of pointless in a way, but it says a lot about Labour mythology that he's the person that people always go back to.
That's it. Compared to some counterfactuals, it's not that.
No, absolutely not. I love it. But
Blair was pretty pro. I mean, it was basically Gordon Brown who stopped us joining the Euro, wasn't it?
Yes.
I mean, Tony Blair wanted us to join the Euro. So, and again, it's hard to imagine that period, the Labour without that constant pull between a push and pull between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and what that did, because essentially it wasn't just Tony Blair in charge; it was Gordon Brown as well. He was at least very, very huge influence on the government, and that had its impact too. And Gordon Brown himself was, much closer to John Smith, I think, in terms of his values and so on, except on Europe. So yeah, it is fascinating. But also the idea you mentioned, Hugo, that did we feel like a young country at that time? Do we just look back and think we felt like a young country at that time because we were young people? But if so, how is it that one fairly young person being in charge could make us feel like that?
But there was a creative explosion, which of course predates Blair. But then he kind of rides that, and it was genuine. I know that people are very kind of down on that. Oh, this was overrated. It's like, but actually, if you look at like music and fashion and art and cinema, it's like there's a load of stuff going on. Figures that still loom large today, and you wonder whether, like Blair was kind of a natural fit, like a front man for that stuff in a way that Smith wouldn't have been. So, Ros, I wanted to just end part of a long-running series of which former Labour leader should we compare Keir Starmer to. Obviously, a lot of people go, oh. He's a Blairite. He's more right wing than Blair. He's more right wing than the Tories. But no, there's obviously a lot of people go, oh, he's just trying to do the Blair thing. And then we've also had discussions of like, well, is he actually a bit more like Harold Wilson, who's got a great deal of interest in, or indeed Gate School? Do you think he might be more like Smith, and not just in the way that he's just doesn't sort of get the sort of pulse racing?
Did Smith transform his party? No, I don't think he did. I think Kinnock did that work. I don't think Smith did it. I think that Starmer's legacy, we don't know what, if he gets into power, he will be confronted with, and what decisions he will have to take that tell us more about his personality. But from what we know so far, we know that he is completely ruthless and 100% in the pursuit of power, and not not in thrall to any particular ideology, and certainly, is willing to cast that aside to get there. We know that he believes very, very strongly in the rule of law as well. I think there's I don't think you can really make the comparison. It's very, very hard to say. But no, I think he's a very, very different proposition, Keir Starmer.
Although I think maybe it's also time for maybe another section we can do on, is Kinnock underrated? Is Kinnock being rehabilitated? Because whenever I'm reading about it, I was like, oh my God, he had just this incredibly difficult job. And he had to do it for a very long time with essentially no rewards. But we'll have to maybe get Anthony back.
There is a whole thing about the rehabilitation of Kinnock that is quite interesting. And I think that happened during the Corbyn years.
Yeah.
Massively, because he was seen as the person who'd done it, before, and this thing was happening again to the Labour Party. So people went back and looked at, what he'd done.
And also someone, of course, had he succeeded, no new Labour. So everybody can like Kinnock. Next time. We've reached the end of the show, so let's briefly do the stories that have gone under the radar this week. Ros.
Oh, I want to talk about the Olympic torch because it's so insane. It's the Paris Olympics, obviously, this summer, and now the torch is coming to France, to Marseille, and it's having a 6-hour parade for it. It's got more than 1,000 boats. Obviously, Macron is going to be there. Over 150,000 people expected. It's insane. The whole, and it's so fascinatingly tied up with politics. And this is the only real thing I find interesting about the Olympics. It's how it blends into politics and the ways in which politicians exploit it.
I once followed the Olympic torch for a week when it was here, obviously, and it was
I hope for money.
Yeah, it was my job.
Article.
It was
Did it change on the way?
It was one of the most
You must have taken a week off work.
Did you keep watching it? At one point, it just turned towards you slightly, and you
They should
knew.
have got you to carry it.
It was one of the most difficult series of articles I've ever written because everywhere you went, everyone would be so excited and thrilled and have fuck all interesting to say. And it's actually quite rare that you get that. You're like, what are you excited about? And they're like, everything. And it's like, say something other than this is amazing. And no one could. It was sort of thrilling and incredibly boring at the same time.
Yeah, simultaneously, it's an international event in which we all get together and forget our differences. And yeah, it's intensely deployed for political purposes. Anyway, that's fascinating.
Hugo, say something that is intensely thrilling but also extremely boring.
Do you know what I might be about to? This is my neglected story. This is the death of the iPad. It's been in the news this week. Apparently, iPad sales are way down. And they reckon they're going to keep going down. They're going to stop dropping by about 2% a year.
Why?
They currently make up about, I think, 6% of Apple's revenues. The idea being other tablets sales are dropping as well. I have an iPad in front of me right now, but apparently people don't want iPads anymore. The phenomenon of the iPad may be at an end.
That's great. What, so they just want phones?
They want phones and they want laptops. Yeah. And so it may be, I remember when iPads first came along and suddenly everyone in our office was carrying them. I remember one of my colleagues saying, it's a file of facts. You'll look stupid in a decade. And he, in a longer term, he may turn out he's right. We'll look back now as the period of the tablets.
That might be like that, because when it was first introduced, I was like, well, who wants that? It's bigger than a phone. It's smaller than a laptop. It's just a kind of like, it's neither here nor there. And then it was hugely successful. And I was like, I was wrong. But perhaps it will turn out that I was right, but very early.
It's not wrong. It's just not right yet.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for vindicating
Great
me.
maxim in journalism.
Anthony.
I'm going to bring us back to Labour and Thatcherism again. Andy Burnham saying that he wants to scrap right to buy in Manchester for 10,000 council houses that he wants to build. I'm not sure how much it's gone under the radar or whether this is going to become a big story in the next weeks or so, because right to buy has always been difficult area for Labour. Angela Rayner was the beneficiary of a right to buy policy.
We know that.
And we know that. But and Labour, fought it so hard in the 1980s. But in reality, is there anything wrong with working class people buying houses? That's the conundrum that
the problem was they just didn't build replacements.
Exactly. So that's the case that will be made by Labour. Is the secondary point to this story, is Andy Burnham sort of on manoeuvres again, re-elected for another term, and he's basically signalling to Keir Starmer that I want some more power to do this. And is the next Labour government going to scrap right to buy and allow people like Andy Burnham to build a lot more council houses, which I think we all agree is massively needed. That's the story that I think is quite interesting today.
Well, mine's an American story. People would have noticed there is an enormous amount of coverage of Gaza protests on American campuses, more coverage than indeed of Gaza itself. And some people were comparing it, naturally, particularly since Columbia University is one of the hubs, to the student protests in 1968, because, Columbia University kicking off, the Democratic Convention coming up in Chicago. People go always at like 1968 again. I was listening to the 538 podcast, very nerdy. And there's a guy going, well, look, in 1968, 40% of Americans said that Vietnam was the most important issue. Is that here, if you scrape together anything vaguely related to the Middle East, you can't get to 10%. He says it is just not what most people are concerned about. And so it feels like it's hugely amplified, literally anything one of these students says. What worries me slightly is that one of the 60s protesters, Todd Gitlin, wrote a fantastic book about the 60s. And one of the things he says that he didn't realize at the time, he says we were very fired up about Vietnam. And he says, even then, he says, we just made so many people angry, that it did help Nixon get elected. And it's that real conundrum. It's like, well, of course, students should be out there and protesting and having these very strong moral values, but it does have political consequences. And I really do worry that if they decide to really make a big deal of it at the August convention, that it could be very, very damaging. And then you'll end up with Trump, who cares much, much less about Palestinians, and it will eventually have achieved nothing. Anyway, that's the show. Thank you to Hugo.
Thank you.
Ros.
Thank you.
And Anthony.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Stick around for the extra bit after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop, and thank you to our supporters. You could join them, get the podcast early without ads, plus lots more goodies by backing us on Patreon. Search Oh God What Now Patreon to find out how, and there's a link in the show notes.
Hello, huge thanks and welcome to the Oh God What Now Underground to Tom Cunningham Jimbo, Duncan, Angus Barber, Truny and Rachel.
And greetings from me and many thanks for your generosity to Elizabeth Gannon, Will Cook, Joe, Chem Zobu and Peter Halliday.
And thanks from me to our brand new supporters, Anne Truick, I hope I got that right, John Lowe, and welcome back to past backers who have returned, Leo Critchley, Jeffrey Luland and Gillian Olf.